discussing corporate governance. Now, what do we mean by corporate governance? I hope you understand what we mean by corporate. Corporate means any business firm, and governance is how is it governed, how is it being managed. So here we are going to talk about how the business firms are being managed, so that all the stakeholders, so that the interest of all these stakeholders is given due importance, right? So I have said the interest of all the stakeholders. Now what do we mean by stakeholders? Stakeholders mean all those entities which have an interest in the firm, all those entities which would want the firm to do well because their own interest is determined by how well the company is performing. So this may include the shareholders. So those who own the shares of the company, in that sense those who are the owners of the company because they own some shares of the company. So shareholders, this would include creditors, those who have offered some loans. This would include the suppliers who are offering raw material, who are selling the raw material to the firm. This would include the employees who are working in the firm. This would include the customers who are buying various items from the firm. This would not only include these entities, it would also include the society, because the society also has a stake in the businesses doing well, because businesses, if they do well, they would provide jobs, they would give impetus to the economic development, growth in GDP, and they would also come up with those products and services which are required by the society. So society also has a stake, the regulatory agencies, the government also has a stake. So all these are stakeholders. The government has a stake because first the various business firms will provide job, then they will give impetus to economic development, as I've already mentioned, and then there would be tax revenue that the government will earn from them. So government also has got a stake, regulatory agencies also have got a stake, right? So basically all these entities which have a stake in the business, they are called stakeholders, and this is different from shareholders because all stakeholders may not be shareholders, but all shareholders are stakeholders. So all shareholders have a stake in the business doing well. However, all stakeholders are not shareholders because some of them could be regulatory agencies, could be the creditors, could be the customers, could be the normal people belonging to the society, could be the customers. So now I hope you understand what I mean by saying that all stakeholders need not be shareholders, but all shareholders have to be stakeholders. Is this okay? Now I talked about regulatory agency. What do we mean by regulatory agency? We have talked about regulations earlier also. We have talked about political legal environment wherein the various businesses are regulated. What do we mean by regulation? Regulation is fixing laws. Regulation is formulating laws. Regulation is deciding rules that the businesses firms will have to play by. The businesses firm will have to adhere to those rules. So all the rules, all the laws which have been formulated. So regulatory agencies basically take care of whether the companies are abiding by these regulations or not, by these rules or not, by these laws or not. And in case they find that some business firm is not abiding by these regulations or they are violating these regulations, then these regulatory agencies have the authority to reprimand and take these businesses to task. For example, if you look at different sectors in India, you would find in so many places we have got so many sectors of economy, we have got regulators. For example, if you talk about stock markets in India, so the regulator is SEBI. If you talk about the insurance market, insurance sector, the regulator is Insurance and Regulatory Development Authority, IRDA. If you talk about banking, then the regulator is RBI. So likewise we have got regulators in various sectors of the economy, right? So I am just trying to explain to you as to what we mean by regulator, because I told you, because all these stakeholders will also include the regulatory bodies, and what did we start with? We said corporate governance is the managing the organization in a manner that the interests of all the stakeholders are not compromised. Interest of none of the stakeholders are compromised and their interests are given due priority. So this is what corporate governance is. Collection of mechanism by which corporates are controlled and operated. So this is basically a collection of mechanism through which corporates are controlled and operated. So the whole idea is that the mechanism should ensure that the businesses are being run in a manner, being operated in a manner that does not compromise the interest of the various stakeholders, right? Again, corporate governance also assigns rights and responsibilities among stakeholders. So if you talk about what corporate governance is, you would find that within the various corporate governance guidelines, you have got rights of all the stakeholders as well as the responsibilities which have been assigned to them. So what would be the responsibility, for example, of directors? Now, this is one thing. So what would be the responsibility of directors? What would the auditors be doing? And what is the job, what is the responsibility of shareholders, and what rights do these have? What rights do the directors have, do the regulators have? So all this would be defined in the corporate governance. Is this fine? Again, corporate governance is running the organization in a manner that prevents any conflict of interest between stakeholders. What do we mean by this? Conflict of interest means when two different stakeholders, their interests are in conflict with each other. What do we mean by this? This means that if we try to satisfy one stakeholder, then the other stakeholder would be impacted. If we try to do something to satisfy the interest of the other stakeholder, the other stakeholders, their interest might get impacted. So this is the meaning of prevention of conflict of interest. Is this okay? This is the meaning of conflict of interest. For example, let us say that supposing the regulators, I'm just giving an example to make you understand what conflict of interest is. Suppose the regulators have been given the right to demand any explanation from a business firm. So this is what the responsibility has been given to the regulators, the regulatory agencies, right? However, if it comes to light that disclosing such information to the regulator might leak out some business secret of the firm, and then it might impact the share prices of the firm in the market because the business secret, the trade secret has been leaked out. Now there would be a conflict of interest between shareholders and regulators, because if you try to satisfy the regulators and provide them all the information that they need, there is a risk of leakage, and this risk of leakage would reduce the share prices, and this would cause problem to the shareholders who already own the shares of the company. On the other hand, if you don't inform the regulators, if you don't provide the explanation that the regulators are seeking, then the share price might keep on increasing. There may not be an impact on share prices and the shareholders may not be impacted, but the regulatory agencies would not be able to fulfill their responsibilities of providing effective regulation to the various business firms. So now there's an conflict of interest, and this is what is the meaning of conflict of interest. So this is just to make you understand what conflict of interest is. Basically, you should understand that corporate governance is the mechanism through which the various business firms are governed, are operated, are controlled. And corporate governance basically outlines those aspects which are required for the proper management of the firm in a manner that the interests of all the stakeholders are protected and that there is no undue conflict between the various stakeholders, right? So this is what corporate governance is all about. Now, why the corporate governance actually is important nowadays? I'll tell you why. For example, if you talk about any firm, any big business firm, you would find that they have shares which are being traded publicly. So it may so happen that let me take an example of Infosys. So supposing I have 1% shares of the Infosys. So I'm owning 1% share of Infosys, which is a big firm, and this even 1% would be a big amount, right? Now let's say I'm owning 1% shares, but if Infosys has to take a decision, then my 1% share is of no great value. Why? Because the decision will be taken by majority, and those who have the remaining 99%, or those who even have, let's say, 20%, they have greater say over the decisions of the company because they own 20% shares, right? On the other hand, I'm owning just 1%. So many a times it may so happen that my interest might be compromised because I am a very minority shareholder. I only own 1%. However, corporate governance rules or corporate governance practices ensure that this does not happen. The interest of even the minority shareholders are protected. Is this fine? I'll give you another example. Now, it may so happen, now you understand that in a company generally, who is going to be paid what amount at the middle level management and the other employees below the middle level management in the hierarchy. Which employee would be paid which amount, or what would be the salary at a particular level in the organization. Now this generally is decided by the top management, and then finally it is signed and approved by the chief executive officer or the boss or the highest authority in the firm, highest executive authority in the firm. So the CEO signs it. But can you tell me who is going to decide how much salary would be paid to the CEO? Because if the CEO has the authority to decide everybody else's salary, everybody else's compensation, then he may award himself a very large amount of salary, a very large amount of compensation, incentives. But then who is going to ensure that this does not happen? For this, we have got a board of directors in firms. In firms, we have got board of directors. These are directors, and they have to approve the salary package to be given to the top management level people, to the CEO, to the various divisional heads, or to the divisional directors, to the divisional heads, to the divisional managers. So the compensation package for the top level management is also decided by a board of directors. Now corporate governance practices provide for this. So there's a provision in as far as corporate governance practices are concerned regarding what will be the procedure for deciding the salary of the top management for the CEO, and how would that particular salary be fixed, and what would be the various components, and then how will it be approved. Is this okay? So these are the reasons why we have got corporate governance practices, why we look for the guidelines as far as the corporate governance practices are concerned. Why we look for corporate governance guidelines. Is this okay? And that is why these kind of corporate governance guidelines are very, very important. Now, as I told you, corporate governance also prevents corporate scandals. We have talked about Satyam earlier. Also, I took up this particular example. Satyam was a company, a software services firm, and what did they do actually? They actually mispresented their accounts, and they showed their company to be earning profits while actually the company was earning losses, was incurring losses. So this came to light later on. Now, how do we ensure that this does not happen in future? We have got corporate governance. We will be studying about one provision within the various corporate governance practices that we have here in India, and that provision talks about an audit committee. It also talks about a whistleblower mechanism. So these mechanisms have been brought in to ensure that such scandals don't get repeated in future. Likewise, the case of Kingfisher. So they had to default on various loans taken from bank. So if we have good, solid, strong corporate governance practices, these kind of incidents won't get repeated in future. And this is one reason why we have got corporate governance and why corporate governance is important. Now this basically, corporate governance is a framework actually. It's some kind of a collection of provisions, collections of rules, collection of guidelines. So this is basically a framework. And this framework actually borrows from the provisions in the Companies Act 2013. Now Companies Act 1956 was amended in 2013. It is one of the longest pieces of legislations across the world, right? So Companies Act came for the first time in 1956 and then it was amended in 2013. So some of the provisions which are there in Companies Act 2013, which was passed by the Parliament, they form the framework of corporate governance practices here in India. What do we mean by this? I'll tell you. Okay, for example, please understand, there are some norms, some rules for disclosure, reporting and transparency. Now these norms have been mentioned in Companies Act 2013, which is now a law in India because it has been passed by Parliament and signed by the President. Now this actually provides framework to the corporate governance practices here in India. How? Now corporate governance demands that you should have these norms, just as it has been mentioned, it has been specified, it has been provided for in Companies Act 2013, right? So these norms are regarding enhanced disclosure, reporting and transparency. So what do we mean by enhanced? Enhanced matlab increased. Enhanced disclosure, so disclosing the various affairs of the company. So the company has to disclose more and more. We are not talking about trade secrets, we are talking about the financial position of the company. Because why? Why is this required? This is required because if the company does not disclose sufficient information about its business, then what will happen? How will the shareholders decide where to invest, whether to invest in this particular company or not, whether to buy the shares of this company or not? How do banks decide whether to loan, whether to provide loan to these companies or not, whether to provide them credit or not, whether they are credit worthy or not? How do the customers decide whether to buy them from not, or would they be able to provide the product on time? Would they be able to deliver it on time? So that is why we want more disclosure on the part of the various companies. We want them to disclose everything in a very transparent manner. Don't hide any information which is crucial for the prospects of the company and which should therefore be known to the customers or to the creditors or to the shareholders. So this is what these provisions talk about. So the companies have to disclose more in more transparent manner, and some reporting guidelines have already been given in Companies Act 2013. Now this provides a framework to our corporate governance practice here in India. Then let's talk about the SEBI clause 49, listing agreement. I told you SEBI is what? Security Exchange Board of India, and basically it is the regulator for the stock markets operating here in India. So all the stock markets, I hope you know that the oldest one in Asia is the Bombay stock market, the Dalal Street, popularly known as the Dalal Street. So BSE is one. Then we have got other stock exchanges. For example, the National Stock Exchange is there in Delhi. Then we have got other state exchanges also in some of the state capitals. So there are so many different stock exchanges, and SEBI is the regulator for all these exchanges, right? Not only the stock exchanges, now they are also taking care of the commodity exchanges. So those exchanges where commodities are getting exchanged, not only the shares. So basically SEBI is this kind of an organization, right? A regulatory body. Now SEBI has a listing agreement which those companies which want to list in a particular stock exchange has to sign. Those companies which want to list in stock exchanges, they have to sign. What do we mean by listing? Listing means when you want your shares to be displayed there on a stock exchange and to be allowed to be traded by the various people operating in that exchange. If you want your shares to be bought and sold in the stock market, to put it simply, so what do we mean by listing? Listing means now your shares are getting bought and sold in the stock market. Now this is what we mean by listing. Why? Because now your shares are listed in the stock market. They are there in the list of those shares which are traded in the stock market. So I'll give you the background. What happens basically, for example, I'm a small firm, supposing, and then I slowly expand and I grow big. Now I'm operating across Uttarakhand, and I'm let's say operating in one more state. Fine. And then I feel that I need to get some money to invest in my business. So what will I do? One option available to me is to list it in some stock exchange. So I may go to National Stock Exchange. I can get my company share listed there, which means my company share will start getting bought and sold there, and this will bring me more money to invest in my business. Why? I sell my shares, and in return I'll get some money which I can invest in my business, right? So this is why I want to list my business in these stock exchanges. However, to list your business in the stock exchange, you need to first talk to the regulator. Ultimately, SEBI is the regulator, so you'll have to first get some clearance from them also. And this listing agreement is something that you have to sign. Listing agreement is an agreement wherein the firm which wants to get its shares listed in the stock market agrees to do certain things, right? So this is what is the meaning of listing agreement. So they have to sign. So every firm which wants to list its shares in the stock market, they will have to sign this listing agreement. Otherwise they would not be allowed to list their shares, right? So is this understood? And now there is a clause 49 there in the listing agreement, which we'll be talking about very frequently. So now this clause 49 also provides framework for the corporate governance practices here in India, right? Now this clause 49 was basically included on the recommendation of the Kumar Mangalam Bilda committee. I hope you know who Mr. Kumar Mangalam Bilda is. You know about the Idea Vodafone acquisition, merger, and Idea Vodafone probably is the largest telecom service provider here in India nowadays. So basically Mr. Kumar Mangalam Bilda comes from the Birla Empire basically, and one of their products was the Idea Telecom service, right? So again, there was another recommendation by Narayan Murthy. Mr. Narayan Murthy has been the founding CEO of Infosys, among India's topmost software services firm, and they also recommended this in 2003. So based on their recommendations, these two committees were set up, and based on the recommendations, some clauses were added in the listing agreement. This was clause 49 which was added in the listing agreement. And what does it say? What it actually says has now been included as framework for corporate governance practices in India. Now we'll be talking specifically about clause 49 and what are the various provisions of clause 49 that provide the backbone of the corporate governance practices here in India. Whenever we move to discussion on corporate governance practices, right? So I'm just trying to tell you what is it that forms the structure of corporate governance practices in India. So one is the provisions of the Companies Act 2013, and we have talked about which specific provisions were there. There were other provisions also, but these provisions were the ones which now form the backbone of corporate governance practices in India, the structure of corporate governance practices in India. And then the clause 49 in the listing agreement, which all the companies which want to list in the stock markets in India, they have to sign. So that clause 49 also provides the structure to corporate governance practices in India. So some aspects of clause 49, which we will be discussing later, they also provide the structure to corporate governance practices in India, right? And then we've got the trade body, Confederation of Indian Industries. They also came up with desirable corporate governance code in 2009. So they came up with a code, advisory in nature. So this was actually advisory in nature in the sense that it was expected that the various companies would adhere to this code. They would try to implement this code in their firm, right? So that was why it was called the desirable corporate governance code. So what is expected of the firms? What is the desired level of corporate governance that is expected from the firm? So that was put into this code, and this again provides a framework to the corporate governance practices here in India. Is this okay? Right? So basically, and there are other organizations and entities also which provide the basic structure and framework of corporate governance practices in India. However, we are not dealing with all of them. We are only talking about the most prominent one. So the most prominent one here in India is SEBI, Clause 49. Now that is mandatory. It is mandated by law also. So naturally, like provisions in Companies Act, mandated by law also. On the other hand, CII was just advisory in nature. So you as a firm may or may not opt to implement these kind of desirable corporate governance codes in your business. So this was just advisory in nature. While the Companies Act 2013 and the norms related for disclosure, reporting and transparency as far as SEBI's Clause 49 of listing agreement is concerned, all of them, they are more mandatory in nature because they are mandated by law basically. So they all together provide the framework of corporate governance practices in India, right? So basically corporate governance is how you are managing the organization, and you should manage the organization in such a manner that the organization should work smoothly without compromising the interest of a particular stakeholder. It should work for the best interests of all the stakeholders. And how do we ensure this? This is what is there in corporate governance. This is fine. For example, I'll take up just one example. As I have talked about the corruption scandals, corruptions and various financial impropriety by various firms, which is very common at least in small firms here in India. So how do you ensure that this does not impact the larger society? How do you ensure that this particular firm is managed in a manner that this kind of financial impropriety doesn't happen? This kind of financial mismanagement does not happen. So there's a provision of audit committees. So we've got audit committees, and there's a provision regarding who will be heading the audit committees. So there naturally needs to be somebody from outside the firm, because if somebody from inside the firm, some executive of the firm is made to head the audit committee, then he may not want to disclose any wrongdoings, any misrepresentation of firms, any misrepresentation of financial position. So he would not want to disclose that. He would not want that to come to light, because after all he is an employee of the firm. So now we have got a provision that audit committees will have to be there in the organizations, but they would not be headed by an executive of the firm. They would be headed by an independent director. So we'll be talking about what independent directors are. Basically, you can understand that they are not part of the firm, they are not employees of the firm, and in that sense they are independent. And since they are independent, they would not have any worries about disclosing the wrongdoings in the company, because in any case the company cannot throw them out, or the company cannot terminate their services, because in any case they are not employees of the firm, they are not executives of the firm. So we have this provision of an audit committee, which will not be headed by some employee of the firm, but it would be headed by a director which is independent, which has nothing to do with the firm. The director has been installed, the independent director has been installed only so that he may ensure that corporate governance practices are being followed rigorously in the firm. So he will not be too concerned about bringing to light such instances of financial impropriety, and ultimately this would lead to the businesses not engaging in this kind of financial impropriety, because the moment they engage in this kind of financial impropriety, what will happen? The directors, the independent directors, may object to it, right? So ultimately we are able to safeguard the interest of all the stakeholders. So this is the basic idea behind corporate governance. I understand that this is a little technical topic, so but don't worry, we just need to have a little bit of an idea, because you'll be reading more about this when we'll be talking about business laws in your third semester. Therein we'll be talking about the Companies Act in more detail, and there you can probably talk about this, but I'll give you just a brief idea. You should try and have a basic understanding of what corporate governance is and what are good corporate governance practices as far as our country is concerned. We'll be continuing our discussion in the next session. Thank you.